Before I hand over to Cathy, just to explain to everyone who's joined, please could you message all your questions to Cathy Owens. You should be able to do that in the chat. Do not send them to me or to any of the other panelists because they are not looking at it. So without further ado, Cathy, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, and thank you for those who are joining us today. And just to say before we kick off as well, we are going to be recording this event, still a bit of housekeeping. So I'm going to start off very quickly laying out some of the context. I'm going to ask Carolyn and Jeremy to give us a few reflections very quickly. And then I'm going to have the privilege of asking you a few questions before we go to the wider audience. So for me, firstly, obviously, we don't want to be too triumphal about this, but we have had a relatively good week in Wales. So hi from Wales. You know, I think in terms of what happened in the last week, there's a few things. Of course, it was related to COVID, but it was related to the way that the Welsh Government and Mark Drakeford and the Welsh Labour values have responded to COVID. So that's about being careful and being cautious, but making the right decisions that sometimes are quite difficult ones, but for the right people at the right time. So it was having a slightly different response to the way that we dealt with COVID in Wales. And also it meant that Mark Drakeford clearly had a higher profile, and the more that people saw of Mark Drakeford in Wales, the more that people liked him. Now that didn't have to be necessarily true. And I think you could make an argument that there was also a higher profile for the opposition leaders during that pandemic and also during the campaign. And I think the opposite is true potentially in those outcomes. But my argument also is that this wasn't just about COVID, because we didn't just have this good result just because of COVID in this election. You know, we keep forgetting that Labour has won 35 to 40% of the result in Wales every single year for 21 years. And we have been in power in Wales for 21 years. And for me, there's a few reasons for that. We've had good leaders that people really quite like. We've had good policies that people really quite like. They've been focused on they're focused on investing in public services, as well as being relatively pro-business. So we've been able to stretch the Labour bloc, in a sense, right from the middle, right over to the left. And there's not enough room on the left for anybody else. There's not enough room on the nationalist side, because we're nationalist enough in the sense we're independent enough for most people in Wales. And, you know, so we've had 35 to 40% solid support for the last 21 years, and that builds you a really decent base in the Senedd in terms of the maths, which means that you can lead a government even if you're doing it with other parties who agree with you on many different things. So if people say this is just about COVID or just about incumbency, I think that's not being fair. So based on those good results, we've got a couple of people here who are going to talk to us about what we think Welsh Labour can teach the rest of the UK. But also, I'd really like to talk a little bit more about, you know, that relationship between the UK Labour and Welsh Labour and the wider progressive family in a way. So firstly, I'm going to introduce my very good friend, Carolyn Harris, who of course is the MP for Swansea East. She's also the Deputy Leader of Welsh Labour, so she would have been involved in the day-to-day running of the campaign and the way that it panned out in Wales. And also we've got the wonderful Jeremy Miles, who I'm so glad he's joined us this weekend, because he's got an even bigger job that he's got to be focused on. He thought he was going to have a bit of a quiet time of it over the summer, and all he's got to sort out is the GCSEs, the A-levels, the universities and the new curriculum in Wales just in the next few months. So firstly, can I ask Carolyn Harris just to kick off for 3 minutes on where we think we are and what we think the Labour Party can learn from Welsh Labour? Carolyn.
Where we are is, I think we were talking about the Welsh Labour election, and I think what people saw from the Welsh Labour Party was that their values were what were our values. So when we were talking to people, they wanted to know about what our offer was and what we'd already provided that we could continue to provide. They also trusted the fact that everything we said that we could offer had been costed and we weren't offering pie in the sky. And I think they also acknowledged that through COVID, Mark and the guys in the Assembly's handling of that had been, well, it's been exemplary, but it was done in such a way that it wasn't scaring people. It wasn't punishing people. but it was done reflectively and thoughtfully. And one of the stories, I'll get this story out of the way now because I think it's absolutely lovely, is I went swimming this week and the lifeguard at the pool said to me, "Oh, you've been out and about everywhere, Carolyn." I said, "I have." And he said, "Yeah, Mr. Drakeford knocked my door a couple of weeks ago." I said, "Oh yeah, Mark's been out and about everywhere too." And he said, "Yeah," he said, "my son came running into the kitchen, George, who's 7, and said, 'Dad, Mark the coronavirus man from the tellies at the front door.'" And I think that just spoke to me about a 7-year-old child who recognised Mark from the TV, Mark from coronavirus, but recognised Mark. And that was really important. So Mark has been the figurehead of our campaign, and he's shown the Welsh people that everything that we've done for them in the past and everything we want to do for them in the future is for their benefit, because what they want and what they need is what the Welsh Labour Party is based on. And Cathy, you talked about us being nationalist and us being left enough. I would say that the people of Wales that did not want to hear the divisive narrative around separating from the UK, they want the union. Yes, they would acknowledge that they want to see the Assembly having different powers, maybe more powers, but they certainly didn't want to see a situation where we were not part of the UK. And in terms for being left enough, I don't think the people in Wales have really ever got to grips with this left-right argument. I certainly didn't, not before I became part of the Labour Party. All they knew was that the Labour Party were the party of the people, and they were delivering for them for what they need. Foreign affairs are not an issue in my constituency. To a great extent, things like arms deals are not a consideration in my constituency. I can count how many emails I get around things like that. But when it comes to stuff which matter to people on every day, like universal credit, universal basic income to a certain extent, the health service, it's the stuff that we use and we need every day is what matters to people in Swansea East and to people in Wales, because basically we are grounded. We're grounded in our values, we're grounded in being Welsh, we have a specific identity, we don't like being told what to do, and we don't like being told what to think. So when it came to making the decision on this election, Mark was the one person out of all the leaders in Wales who was saying, we're not going to tell you what to think, we're not going to tell you what you want, we know what you need because we've worked with you for a long time. We will just make sure we'll deliver and we will maintain on the promises that we've made in the past and we make going forward. So I think, and that message, if you value it, vote for it. That was absolutely outstanding because it came in at the right time. And we were, I mean, I actually made a video with the wonderful Jeremy Miles when I said, if you value him, vote for him. Because that's the important thing. The people who were sitting incumbents, who we've returned, all of them, are because people trusted them, because what they were offering was of value. And when we said value it, vote for it, we were talking about every single candidate, especially those who we returned and the seats that we took. So well done, all of you. Very proud of you and very proud to be Welsh.
Fabulous, thank you. And Jeremy, I know you've got a big job to do, but just reflecting on where we are and the fact that 21 years in, we've got a working majority, effectively, Labour government. Why do you think that is? And why do you think, you know, we are so spectacularly successful at winning elections, I guess?
Well, I mean, first thing I think to say is that I completely agree with how you framed it. It wasn't, as it were, simply about COVID or incumbency, but being in government during the last year has enabled people in Wales to, you know, evaluate the performance of Welsh Labour on the most critical issue of any of our lives at the moment. So, you know, for us in government in Wales, it's been about demonstrating what Labour does in government, and that obviously is different for the party in different parts of the UK. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, but I absolutely don't think that it was about COVID and nothing else. I think clearly people in Wales felt that, you know, we had taken the right decisions, even if at the time they were sometimes unpopular. But I think the other crucial factor is that there was a strong sense, I think, that we had a very credible offer to people about what we wanted to change. So last summer I did some roundtable work in the government on changes post-COVID in government policy, and some of the polling that some of the third-party organisations have done in their own worlds were saying to them that what people want is change, but change that you can believe in. And I think that is what we were offering people in Wales. So we had a very solid offer on bread and butter issues, whether that was a jobs or education guarantee for young people, paying the real living wage in social care, a massive house building programme, recruiting more doctors, and all those things I think resonated. Firstly, because our offer to people was credible, but also the issues that I've just listed are ones which I think people felt very keenly were ones which had been exacerbated, if you like, by COVID. And so I think we were reflecting people's aspirations for what we would, for how to come out of COVID, if you like, in that strong offer. So I think that sense of connection was very strong. There are two sort of big themes, I think, which it's worth thinking about what the implications are for the party across the UK. The first is a strong sense, I would say, that Welsh Labour is on your side. So, in different parts of the UK, we saw in the Hartlepool by-election, the legacy of Brexit and our relationship with our perhaps traditional voters as a consequence of that is still obviously very live. But, we had seats in Wales, in particular in some of our South Wales Valleys communities, which voted Leave very strongly, which returned Senedd members who, whilst themselves were Remain campaigners, if you like, or certainly in favour of remaining, they were returned with majorities, in some cases double. So I think there's an interesting lesson in comparing those two sort of experiences, and we can maybe come on to talk about that. My own reflection is that the experience of the Welsh Labour government's actions during COVID on the one hand, and that really credible bread and butter offer on the other, actually gave people a strong sense that we are on their side. And so I think, in a sense, that issue about Leave Remain is less relevant in Wales as a consequence of that. So I think that's worth exploring. And the second big theme, I think, is that we had a campaign which was strongly patriotic and had a very strong sense of the Welsh national identity at its heart. Now, this is absolutely not, just to be clear, an electoral tactic. I think it's absolutely very much part of the makeup and personality of Welsh Labour naturally, if you like. But we ran a campaign which was patriotic and majoritarian in the context of Wales, and I think that is absolutely essential. It's a more complex question, I think, for the Labour Party in different parts of the UK, in particular, perhaps in different parts of England. But what seems to me very important as a lesson to learn, if you like, or an observation to make, is that sense of place-based identity is, I think, really important. And I think, we are able to do that in Wales. Welsh Labour is, in a very real sense, the national party of Wales. And I think the challenge for the party in different parts of the UK is to perhaps also instill that sense in voters.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I've got a pretty challenging question to begin with, I think, in that having worked in government here in Wales, Carolyn, you've worked with the leadership at a UK level. Over the last 20 years, we've had a really interesting relationship between leadership in Wales and leadership at a UK level, both in government and out. And sometimes you get the impression that the leadership at the UK level are slightly embarrassed about talking about Wales sometimes, because they've sort of bought into the narrative the Daily Mail and the Conservatives like playing, which is something that the Welsh Labour have managed Wales badly for the last 21 years by picking up on certain areas of the NHS or certain areas of education without looking at perhaps at a broader picture. But there's plenty of areas in Wales that where, in terms of policy, where we led on that people have ignored for 20 years in terms of not having competition in the health sector and leading in some areas. Particularly, I think COVID has highlighted some of the ways that we work in a partnership basis with local governments. We've been able to roll out the vaccine a lot quicker because of the systems that we've had. The test and trace system vastly different here. So some of those decisions that we've made, are we still in a position where I think the leadership in Wales is sometimes, get slightly frustrated with the leadership at the UK level, saying, come on, guys, why don't you talk about this as a really good example of how you run a country?
Well, I would say that we do try to talk about it, but when you have Tory MPs from North Wales who continually talk down Wales and the Welsh government, it's very difficult because they will home in on really individual issues, whereas we're trying to talk up a country and the policies that we deliver in as a country. But you can bet your bottom dollar that the Tories from North Wales will always find the one person who's waited too long for a hip replacement, and that they will always talk that up. And obviously, when they talk, then they get the press around that. It feeds into the Daily Mail narrative. Any UK Labour leader who would be embarrassed to be associated with Welsh Labour at this moment in time would be absolutely insane, because what we've done over the last few months has shown that we are, without a doubt, I mean, Jeremy talks about distinctive identity. We are who we are because we are what we are. We do what we do. Every time I open my gob, you can't disguise the fact I'm Welsh, and I'm proud of it. We do try really hard, but it's like anything else. When you're in opposition at a national level, the stones that the Tories are throwing, whether it's from the front bench or the back benches, will always be about the good. We are the only place in the United Kingdom that has a Labour government. So we are the entire focus of every backbench and front bench Tory to try to discredit us. So it's a huge machinery that we're up against. We do need to get better at it. But from now on in, given the victory, let's not be embarrassed to say it, given the victory that we've had in Wales, then it's up to every single Welsh Labour MP and every Labour MP to start talking about Wales and the successes that we've got. And that's the job for me and my Welsh colleagues, to make sure that they do understand what we've done is quite phenomenal. We have backed a national trend. Unbelievable what we've achieved. But we did that on a daily basis. Every day we talked about where there may be cracks, where there may be weaknesses. And we went in and we plugged those gaps immediately. I mean, it was exhausting, but it worked. So that's the problem we got. Jeremy.
So I mean, I think the point you made has definitely been true at points. There seems to be no question about that. I don't actually think it's especially true at the moment, really. I do think that there's a great recognition, I suppose, in the leadership of the party on a UK basis now that Wales can demonstrate Labour success in government, and I think that's very wise of the leadership to take that view. But I think, in a sense, I think Carolyn's point is important in this way, that, you know, it's about the context into which you're describing that Labour performance, isn't it? And generally speaking, on a UK-wide level, you know, not to sound disgruntled about it, but the level of kind of understanding or interest really in what happens in Wales is pretty minimal. Now, and so that's an important context, I think, for how you convey messages and the way Carolyn was describing. What I will say, though, I think that the experience of COVID has changed that to some extent. It certainly feels like that from Wales. I'd be interested when we open up for the floor to hear if other people feel like that. But my sense is that the general kind of understanding of the different devolution settlements and so on, or the different the existence of devolution settlements, I guess, in some ways, and what different governments are doing in different parts of the UK has increased, you know, it feels to me quite significantly, really. And I think, you know, there have been good news stories from Wales in relation to the handling of COVID. And I think probably they are, you know, they help to create a different picture on a UK basis. But, you know, at the end of the day, one of the you know, advantages or assets that devolution was felt to bring at the start, if you like, in all parts of the UK, was that it enabled governments to do things differently and then learn from each other. And I think in a way, you know, there's a long way to go in that sense. You were saying, you know, that we, as it were, in Wales, have exported a number of ideas, if you like, to other parts of the UK, and obviously that's happened vice versa. And I think, you know, in a better understood system, people across the UK would recognise that there was that sort of cross-fertilisation, and that would give a better context, I think, for Labour's message about Wales.
Thank you. And my next question is more about, you know, we're talking about progressive politics and looking to the future, where Labour goes around, you know, all in all parts of the UK. I think one of the benefits of the Welsh Labour being in government is that there has been a bit of renewal in the last few years in terms of the ideas within government. You know, it's not the opposition parties that are pushing the ideas about how we live in a modern world, how we are reacting to the change in work. You know, I think that the Welsh government have been part of the COVID response as well. Has it been about adapting to new ways of working? It's not about saving Pret. You know, we've already been working on the foundational economy, Jeremy, which you've been talking about for quite some time. We're not paying Tesco's rate bill. We're not focusing on millionaires' PPE contracts. We're already moving more directly towards massive change around tackling climate change and transport issues, which you can see not just in the reshuffle that's happened this week, but in what we've been talking about for the last 2 years. We haven't been forced into that by the opposition parties, is what I think I'm trying to say. So isn't there something that the UK Labour Party government can learn from that already, in terms of that modern, you know, we are meeting people where they live and work in the modern world?
So, I mean, that's definitely feels like that. So, you know, when you've been in government for 22 years, you know, obviously renewal and, you know, change in government is very difficult in a sense, isn't it? If in a conventional way. And I think the way you do that is by having a really clear focus on core values. And, you know, this sounds trite in a way, but I think it's easy to forget actually in practical terms. You know, the economy changes around us, partly through government action, partly through the market. And actually the test constantly for governments is, what does this new dynamic mean for how we apply our values, really? And I do think there's been an openness. It's not always straightforward, because if you're in government, you're working with the civil service, and sometimes, you know, you've got to win you've got to win the argument and win ground within the government for these changes to be made. But I think it's been pretty successful. And, you know, each new kind of intake of Labour members to the Senate has contributed to that, I think. So I think it's, you know, the test isn't really, you know, what the specific policy is. The test is how do you basically apply your values to what's changing around you, really. And I think, you know, the most obvious example of that, I think, is the one that you're touching on, which is the foundational economy stuff, which, you know, was not visible really, actually, before about the start of the last Senate term. But, you know, actually the government embraced it, and it will actually have a real impact in people's lives. And that sort of thing, you know, is about, as I say, it's a new policy approach, but applying basic Labour values, really.
And Carolyn, do you think that, you know, how do we ensure that the UK party takes note of these sorts of really interesting ideas that are coming from Wales, not just looking at Wales in terms of how to tackle the rise of nationalism, for example, but actually looking at Wales as a petri dish for where some of the best ideas are coming from?
Yeah, and that's the problem, isn't it, Cathy? It's like Jeremy said, how do we get recognition that we so rightly deserve? You know, we can, and that partly is down to when you're in opposition, then you cannot deliver on anything. You can only challenge, you can only criticise what a government is doing. And sometimes the UK government has to do stuff which the Welsh government has done quite similar. And then as an opposition party, do you criticise something that's already going on within a Labour administration, or do you let it ride? So it is a difficult situation. I think there'll be a sea change now. I think we'll see things completely different now. I mean, we've had a really tough few years in that. I saw a massive change in politics in 2015, a massive change. Up until that point, I'd never really seen the tensions like I saw from 2015 on, and those tensions have grown and grown and grown, and that has damaged the messaging for the UK party without a shadow of a doubt. And in 2019, when I was knocking doors, I was not seen as a Welsh politician. I was seen as part of the UK party, because it was a general election and the focus was on national policies and not regional policies. And I'm from a Leave seat, and I was knocking doors, and they weren't, well, we were making phone calls and visiting people. They talked about Brexit a bit, but you could actually talk people around and say, but in Wales, and you give them the information about the damage that was doing in Wales. What I couldn't talk people around was around the leadership at the time, because people were absolutely aghast at the way that they thought as a party we were going. We haven't got that in Wales. We have a First Minister who may be slightly lefter than I am, but he's a pragmatist and understands that to be electable, you have to appeal to all the people, not some of the people. Whilst we were at a national level, we were appealing to a section of society, and we were alienating masses of the communities. Mine especially, I can remember going to visit an old people centre who I went countless times before and was literally being chased around by somebody delighted to tell me they were going to vote for Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was not on the ballot paper, but you may as well have had the UK Labour leader and Boris Johnson on the ballot paper, because that's how they voted. They don't do that with the Senate elections, luckily enough, because with the Senate elections, the Senate has been able to deliver and portray itself as a far more reasonable and productive and thoughtful government, which puts Wales first. And that's the big thing. We have to, and because England has not got a distinct nationality like we have, different parts of England will have different nationalities, different identities, then that is the problem. We need to capitalise on the fact that we have a very specific Welsh identity, and we need to use that to ensure going forward that all Welsh politicians are seen as Welsh and not just part of the UK Labour Party.
Okay, if I could ask people that are watching this from home, do stop putting some questions in the chat and I will pick up on those. The first question I'm going to go to is from Gareth Sanderlands, and I think he's making a good point, because he's from the Vale of Clwyd. And we've got to say, not everything in the garden is rosy. There is still some work to do. There are some people to be winning back. We've got our own little red wall that you might describe it in North East Wales. There's clearly some work to be done there, although we only lost one of those seats. We clearly need to do something about talking to the voters there. And I think Gareth has identified that the Conservative Party now have a very good data set of people who voted for them in 2019 for the Conservatives and who voted Brexit potentially. They know who those voters are, and if they could have turned those Senedd voters out in the Senedd election, then we might have had a very different response. And that maybe they didn't, just because they spent the last year telling everybody the Senedd is so unimportant, they couldn't get their own voters out. But we have got some work to do in that part of the world, but also in the valleys areas, and we've got a potential of growth as well. It seems to be in the southwest. So it's there's still a lot of work to do. Jeremy, where would you focus that work, and what would you do in the next few years?
Well, I mean, I think, on the red wall point, firstly, obviously it was awful to lose the Vale of Clwyd. I mean, that's, had strong Labour representation from the start of the Senedd, really. And I think the point you're making, but actually, it was narrower than I think the Tories would have expected. And I think it's absolutely clear the Tories had a greater set of expectations. A greater set of expectations for what they would achieve in our North Wales seats than they did accomplish. Now, I think there's a discussion to be had about why that was different at the Assembly election, at the Senedd elections, than in the UK-wide elections. And I think we've touched on some of those things. Partly it's about leadership, partly it's about a credible offer, which I don't think was, those assets weren't available to us in the UK-wide election last time. But I think there's definitely a job of work to be done in the seats in the north to support the party there to win those seats back at the next UK general election. Obviously, they're fundamental to a UK-wide general election success. So that's absolutely essential. But I mean, I think, there's definitely, to be absolutely clear about this, there's absolutely no sense at all of a kind of resting of the laurels. That just isn't true. So even in seats, so in my own constituency, for example, my majority almost doubled. There's no sense in which I'm going to say, well, that's great news, thank you very much. That's, there's work to be done, isn't there, to make sure those relationships are embedded and they come out to vote the next set of elections in 5 years' time. And that's the truth in lots of South Wales seats. I do think the point you're making about South West Wales and West Wales more broadly is really interesting, and I've been a little overlooked, I think, in the overall analysis for reasons which are probably understandable. But there are some majorities of true blue Labour seats really which are now down to 2,000 votes, from where they were previously. And I think, at the general election, there was a sort of view that that would be an area where we should focus assets and resources. And I think, obviously that wasn't a credible proposition then, but actually, given the Senedd results, I think there's definitely, there's more to build on there in other parts of Wales where we haven't held those seats in the Senedd. We have the prospect of doing that in future, it seems to me.
Carolyn.
I think the difference between what happened in the Vale of Clwyd is, I think if Anne had stood again, we probably would have held on to it. That's the bottom line. I think a part of the problem has got to be was incumbency. Anne was well respected, and I saw Anne during the campaign, and she will be sorely missed. Jason was a brilliant candidate, but it's always difficult when you are a new candidate. At this time, was always going to be difficult. So I think that's fair to say. There's also two other things which the Tories have that we don't, and that's money and arrogance. And where they can throw money at stuff, even if it's only letters, which they were doing a lot of throughout both the general election and the Senedd election. They were just bombarding people in areas like that we're talking about with propaganda letters, and they were continually saying the messaging was around the fact that they felt that they had a better offer, and people were already weakened. They were already receptive to the Tory message. They proved that from 2019. And then there's the arrogance that they knew best. And this is their biggest downfall, because I was talking to Tories throughout the election, and they had the arrogance that they'd won Wrexham. They were arrogant. You'll have to believe that. They were reconcentrating their efforts to challenge further. They really didn't see what was coming, which was beyond belief for me, because I was out and about and I just couldn't believe, I just didn't see anybody out or doing anything, because it was all being done through social media or whatever. So I think I never want us to be that arrogant that we take any vote for granted, because that's what they've done. They took their voters for granted. They didn't get the turnout that they thought they would get. They didn't get the support they thought they would get, but they did throw an inordinate amount of money at it, and they shoveled the arrogance in bucket loads, which we didn't. We spoke to people. We listened to people. We asked people what they wanted. We told people what we could offer them, and we didn't make promises that we couldn't keep. So, I'm really sad that we didn't keep it, but the incumbency was always going to be an issue there, and I'm really sad to see the land's gone.
And we've got to be really, we can't be complacent about that part of the world, and we have got to work very hard. Okay. Can I just
say on that? Yeah. Can I just come back in on that? Because I think, on a kind of campaigning theme, I think what is possible, certainly our approach as the Welsh Labour Party in Senedd elections, is to treat the 40 constituencies really as 40 by-elections, if you like, and to fight campaigns which are very, I would say, very attuned to local consideration. So there's a very strong national campaign, but we saw, I'm sitting, as it happens, in the Vale of Glamorgan at the moment, and we saw Jane Hutt, the member here, substantially increase her majority in a seat which is very different from a South Wales Valley seat where majorities are also increased. So I think there's something about fighting elections on a very kind of bespoke basis in each constituency, which probably is more achievable perhaps in a Senedd election than in a UK-wide general election. But, actually it ought to be doable in that context as well. And I think that's a bit of the answer to how we win back some of the seats which we lost in the UK general election.
Well, Buffy done that. Buffy proved that, the way that Buffy ran the Ronda. I mean, it was a very personal campaign based around Buffy's identity and Buffy's work, and Buffy's that the people knew Buffy from the work that she'd done, and the result was phenomenal. And that's how we done it. Every seat was different, and we treated every seat differently.
So my next question is from Ellie Anderson, and it's about the rise of support for Yes Cymru, which seemed to signal the rise of support for nationalism. And I think I'm going to start by trying to answer this question, actually, because, with my talking to my chums in Plaid Cymru, as I do on a fairly regular basis, there's a couple of things there for me. One of which is, to begin with, it's quite tricky for us sometimes because it's not that sexy to be in the middle. It's quite sexy to be at either end of the argument, either abolishing the Senedd or, full independence, let's climb a castle. And it's actually not sensible, not sexy to be able to talk about what we can do that's better together and all those sorts of things in terms of pooling sovereignty and home rule. And somebody said confederalism. I think, you know, that confederalism does not look good on a t-shirt. So, but what we seem to have done in Wales is be able to embrace, as Welsh Labour, being able to sort of play a role which is the best of both worlds, to be able to say, actually, it does actually work for us, that we can make all these decisions differently in Wales, but that we can also sort of stand up to London when we need to and make different decisions. We have got some weaknesses in the system we are going to have to deal with. And Jeremy, the internal market bill is going to be an absolute nightmare, I think, over the next year. But I would argue that sort of Welsh Labour is Welsh enough and is independent enough so that people who might be incurious and might join the Yes Cymru on Twitter are still voting Labour. And I think I said to my colleagues colleagues and friends in Plaid Cymru, I think they just took it for granted that if people were slightly incurious, that they'd be voting for Adam Price. And I don't think they even did the work in, you know, let's just pick Caerphilly to say, well, are floating voters in Caerphilly thinking that independence is the first thing that's going to be their priority for on what they're going to be voting for in this Senedd election? So I think they got their strategy completely and utterly wrong. And I think where Welsh Labour is, you know, we sort of sit where most people in Wales sit with regard to the idea. We quite like the concept of independence, but the practicalities we realise will have a really significant effect on the people that we care about and the way that we live and work. Do you think that's fair, Jeremy?
Yes, I mean, I think it's you know, there's an interesting question here, isn't there? I think the two key things are that there has been a rise in the membership of Yes Cymru, or the existence of Yes Cymru, and the increase in its membership, which has been sharp and marked. And the interesting question, I think, for us, and the, you know, existential question, I think, for Plaid Cymru is why that has been necessary, why that support plainly isn't transferring to Plaid Cymru. You know, clearly it isn't. So I think that's, you know, it's a challenge for other parties, not for us in that sense. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is this: I think, you know, the sharp increase has happened over the last 18 months or so, which has been a period where, you know, our lives have been dominated perhaps by online engagement rather than the kind of talking to people in the streets political engagement. My own view is that if we'd been in more benign and normal times, it would have been more apparent sooner that the traction which Yes Cymru has developed on social media isn't being reflected in people's daily conversations. Now, that isn't to say that there hasn't been an increase in the extent to which independence is talked about. Plainly there has. And it's not to say that there isn't some increase in the level of support for independence, or at least a drop in the level of fear about independence, if you like. It's seen as an option amongst others rather than somewhere where, you know, where you could never go. So, and there's definitely a challenge for us as a party and a movement in that, since we believe in a union, but a better union. But at the end of the day, my own view is that, and our manifesto is very clear for the Senedd elections, that if we came back into government as we have, we'd want to lead a kind of national conversation around this, because what I think has happened over the last year is there's been a growth in the kind of headlines around independence, but no real growth in the understanding or the kind of discussion around what it means in practice. That has not been a feature, I think, of political discussion in Wales, really. And I think there is there's obviously debate to be had, but we've got a very clear view about having a kind of federal constitution where home rule is possible. And I think when that debate is had in a way that I think it will be in the coming years, I think the balance will shift, and I think the people will, the support which appears there now will begin to kind of move towards a slightly more kind of federalist approach. I have to say, though, in terms of what this means for the UK-wide party, and Carolyn may disagree with me about this, I think, in particular, given what may be happening in Scotland, we don't have very much time, I think, as a UK-wide party to develop a set of proposals about radical change across the UK, which reflect the sort of things I've been talking about now, but which continues, to be based on the union of the four nations, really. I think that is an urgent thing, because, there needs to be an offer which the party can make. This isn't for me to say because it's about Scotland, but it definitely has an impact in Wales as well. There needs to be a case which can be made to people in Scotland if a referendum is held about the kind of UK that's the alternative. So I think that is our task as a party. We should be leading on that. And my personal view is that, the thinking that we are doing in Wales around that is pretty cutting edge in terms of UK-wide constitutional terms about how you keep the union but make it one that is fit for purpose, really. So, I welcome that debate because I think we have the right ideas around it.
So Carolyn, that's a bit of a question in terms of making sure that the UK Labour leadership really listen to Scotland and Wales about what is happening and where the ideas are coming from. Yeah,
well, I mean, Keir has already talked about a form of federalism, which I know that Jeremy is an advocate for, and he's right. I don't necessarily agree with him because I am very much a traditionalist and see that the union is precious, and anything that I think is going to disrupt that, it does worry me. I think what we've seen with Yes Cymru, which Jeremy's already said, was that it's a keyboard warrior movement. I don't think it's had the impact in real life that they would have liked to have had. And I also think that there was again, an arrogance amongst Plaid Cymru that they were automatically going to be supporting them. And I think they also thought the 16 and 17-year-olds were going to be more attracted to the idea of independence. And I don't think that they were either as attractive or that interested in the election, full stop. If they voted, they obviously didn't vote Plaid because they voted because we are where we are. So I just think that I tread cautiously around this whole agenda, but I am worried about any kind of referendum in Scotland, because I think that now will dominate the next X number of years of the UK Parliament, will be dominated by what's going to happen in Scotland. And if it becomes an issue in Scotland and they win a referendum, then I am really fearful about where we go in Wales. And that's what we have to get really strong and firm and have an offer which reflects that people want something different, but they don't want to separate. And we really have to work hard on that one.
So I just want to say, really, I don't myself, I don't want to come over as dismissing the growth in Yes Cymru membership. I absolutely am not doing that, to be clear. I think it's something which needs to be taken seriously. But the way in which it most needs to be taken seriously is this, I think. Quite a lot of people, and there are Labour Party members who I know who belong to Yes Cymru. And I think that we'll continue to see that, frankly. I think there is a possibly quite significant category of people who are sort of, exasperated and decurious, if I could put it like that. And it's not a very nice way of describing it, but people who say to themselves, well, look, we vote Labour in Wales and we get Welsh Labour governments in the Senedd. We vote Labour in UK general elections and we consistently get Conservative governments. What's the solution to that? And this appears to be the solution to that in a very sort of, initial way. So, the reason we need to take that seriously is because that cohort will grow unless we can win the next general election. So that is our obligation, actually, is to do every single thing we can to make sure that we win the UK general election so that we can introduce, constructive change across the UK. Because if we don't, we will see a sharp increase, I think, in Labour members who are attracted to that, and that will pose its own challenges for us.
So we can't win an election without Scotland.
So a lot of people you think are thinking that independence is some sort of bulwark against a Conservative government, and we need to be able to fix that. We need to find that argument in those areas. Okay, there's a question from the delightful Vicky Evans from Neath, who was making a point about incumbency, but actually, a lot of Labour members have rooted themselves in their communities. A lot of Labour representatives are rooted in their communities. So why would we be surprised that they pushed Plaid Cymru back a bit in those areas like Caerphilly and Neath and Blaenau Gwent and Labour? I mean, why have we been surprised about how well we did there? Should we be surprised? Because it seems to me that Plaid Cymru, where their vote went up, it was in those seats which they already hold, which is mainly in the Fôr Gymraeg.
Yes, I mean, I think the reason we're surprised, if I can, in that way, is because I think we had a twofold reason, really. One is the, polling around Assembly elections it doesn't give you the right predictions, basically, just because of the numbers of seats and the scale of the majority. It just isn't conducive to that. So, you don't get a sort of a very robust picture, it seems to me, in some of the polling. And the kind of public discourse around Plaid Cymru was obviously heightened, which in its own kind of narrow way is a bit of a success for them, although it didn't end up being positive ultimately. So I think that is an issue. And also clearly going into the campaign, we were conscious of people who'd previously voted Labour who'd switched to Plaid for the last general election, and sort of, what that would mean. But I completely think that Vicky's question is right, really. What you had was a pattern for incumbents who were hardworking MSs doing well, but also you also had new candidates who were, and there are two in particular in constituency seats, who are new members of the Senedd, who were firstly rooted in their communities to start with, but worked phenomenally hard to build, genuine networks of support in the constituency. I was talking to one new member who says, I can't leave the house without being hugged since the election. And that level of affection, I think. But that is about authenticity at the end of the day. That is about, I think that's about people having a sense of connection with their representatives.
Just very quickly, because we've only got 4 minutes left, and there's a question here which I think is interesting, which I'm going to start answering myself. Where does the Welsh Labour Party see themselves on the Corbyn wing or the Starmer wing of the party? And my point is, I think Welsh Labour is an entirely different beast, in that whichever part of whatever matrix I'm supposed to be sitting on, we all seem to get on most of the time. We seem to have avoided a lot of this cultish cliquery. And we look like a party that quite likes each other, although we sometimes have some internal discussions around politics, which is really what politics is for, right? So, we seem to have managed that quite well. So Carolyn, Jeremy, if you could give some reflections on that, maybe there's something there that the UK Labour Party can learn from us while she's all getting on all the time.
I mean, I think I said that at the start of what I was speaking, and said that, the Labour Party in Wales, for me, is about the Labour Party. I didn't join a left-wing or right-wing or a centre-left party. I've worked and I've devoted huge chunks of my life to the Welsh Labour Party. And it's because we are one unit, we are one family. We have got a tiny, tiny little bit of, should we call it friction? But nothing like they've had in the rest of England. And that has been a major, major problem. So, I mean, nobody needs guessing which side of the party I'm on. I think I've shown that. But on the other hand, I can work with anyone who's prepared to work with me, and anyone who's singing from the hymn sheet that I want to sing from, regardless of the base of their politics. I'm happy to work with them. I've worked with Tories, for God's sake. In order to get things achieved. It's about achieving, and we are very good at achieving in Wales because we do reflect the values of the Welsh people.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I don't think it's a particularly, useful debate really to see it in those terms about which wing of the party is it on. I think the party in Wales has the same range of intellectual and political influences as the party in any other part of the UK. And other ones on top of that, actually. So I think the key difference is that there is genuine desire for unity in the party in Wales. And so it's a question of reconciling differences rather than entrenching them. I think that's generally, the approach which most members have. And I think, as a party in government in Wales, in the Senedd, there's a strong level of discipline. I would say, if you look around the Senedd group, there are, the range of opinions and the range of perspectives that you'd have in the Parliamentary Labour Party, I guess. And we have we recognise that in order to continue being able to govern and actually change people's lives, you need to be able to reconcile and have those debates in a way which is respectful and doesn't lead to disunity. And I think we've been very effective at that, really.
Great. Well, on that very positive note, where I think what we're saying to the rest of the UK parties, so all you need to do in the next couple of years is look like a party that really gets on, really likes each other, really wants to make a difference to people's lives, making the right decisions for the people that we care about, and actually living in the country that we live in. That sounds really easy and straightforward, and we look forward to that happening across the UK.
Come off social media and come into the real world.
Exactly. But I just want to say thank you very much for taking this time on a Sunday. I mean, what else would we be doing on a Sunday but talking about politics in Wales? Thank you ever so much, Carolyn, and thank you very much, Jeremy. And Jeremy, we're really looking forward to seeing you getting your feet under that desk as Education Minister on Monday, and we're all thinking about you. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody that joined us today. Thank you. Bye.